With the trials, then it seems like you said before that it was a hung jury, and it
Mhm.
almost seems like the that was enough for them. The almost the goal and the agenda was not to actually get decent justice for the horrific things that occurred, but just get enough so that the president of America and the media could finally see the proposed threat of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and to cast aspersions on the organization rather than actually sort the actual issue that happened at. Would that be right?
Yeah, we actually have both one of the main prosecutors, one of the U.S. attorneys. He's an assistant U.S. attorney who was leading up the polygamy prosecutions, but was added onto this case at the last minute. He actually says later, years later, that that a hung jury was actually the best scenario for them. We also have a Salt Lake Tribune reporter who writes a letter to his wife just before the verdict comes, or the lack of verdict comes. And he writes to his wife and he says, it's really odd that we really don't want a guilty verdict. That's not best served. And I think that in that space was, because there wasn't a conviction, then the stories just blossomed and just spun
Ah,
out of control. That there was no, I mean, in the 19th century, there are very few limits on kind of sensational journalism. That is something that is happening across the board. But the lack of a conviction actually propelled the narrative further. And in the 2 years, so John D. Lee's first trial is in 1875. In July of 1875. The second trial is in 1876, and he's actually convicted. The church helps at that point and kind of helps make sure that the witnesses show up and testify, um, and there is a new U.S. attorney who is not focused on convicting the church, just wants to convict the actual perpetrators of the crime. And but Brigham Young dies the next year in 1877, and in that 2 year space from John D. Lee's first trial to 1877, the narrative of Mountain Meadows completely changes, and Brigham Young now ordered the massacre. And that narrative is going to endure for a century, more than a century. It's going to
wow.
endure, for 150 years to today. You're going to have things like Under the Banner of Heaven, which is still going to argue that Brigham Young ordered that, and add
Does it?
new conspiracies that Brigham Young also ordered the death of Joseph Smith. But it's going to take up. And you mentioned Godless before. Godless is not. It is very accurate in depicting a 19th century novel about the Mountain Meadows Massacre.
Oh, I see.
Does that make sense? So it's definitely a fictionalized. But for those who haven't seen Godless, the antagonist in the story, the central baddie in the story, is one of those orphan children that the Mormons killed his parents, and then he is raised by Isaac Haight, which isn't true. The Haights didn't take in any orphans from the massacre, but his father teaches him this religion, that his religion is basically to kill. That Mountain Meadows becomes emblematic of who Mormons are, rather than this horrific exception to who Mormons are.
I didn't realize that it was mentioned in Under the Banner of Heaven. I haven't watched
Yeah,
it, but
the last episode very clearly gets to Mountain Meadows. Actually, my Convicting the Mormons book, my manuscript was due the same day the last episode of Under the Banner of Heaven was dropping. And I had talked to producers, I tried to get a copy earlier, but because it wasn't like an immediate piece that would bring attention, immediately, they didn't want to give me permission to see it early. So I had to ask my publisher if I could have one more day. So I finished watching the episode as soon as it dropped. It dropped at like 10 p.m. And at 2 a.m., I turned in my manuscript
No way.
because I had to write something about this last piece. But the basic thesis of So Under the Banner of Heaven looks at two horrific murders that happened in Utah in the 1980s,
Mm-hmm.
and but tries to make these ties back to Mormon history, to Latter Day Saint history, and and the basic thesis is that Mormonism produces violent men. I mean, that is the kind of the basic thesis of the show, is that this, again, just like those 19th century sensational novels, that this is a product of Mormonism rather than something exceptional and something that is horrific and not accepted. This is just what Mormonism does.
Very strange. Very, very strange. Tying in with
But also very slick. And we kind of,
unfortunately,
like Godless, they never use the word Mormon, but they do name Mountain Meadows. And I was just watching Godless. I mean, it's marketed as like a feminist Western,
yeah.
I was watching it for Lady Mary. I and was very surprised when Godless, when Mountain Meadows suddenly showed up.
So was I. I remember watching it. My wife loves westerns, so we quite often watch westerns, and we kind of looked at each other when it was mentioned, and be like, "What?"
Yeah.